I'm in the Mount Royal riding days before the 2011 election. I was walking down the street and I saw a poster for an independent candidate who's running on an interesting platform. I was surprised to see he's running in this riding against Erwin Kotler for the Liberals, Sali Zaidel for the Conservatives, and Jeff Itkush for the NDP. So I decided to give Abraham Weizfeld a call and see if he could spare a few moments to explain his positions. Just start off with asking you to tell me a bit about your background and why you decided to run in this federal election.
The reason that I was running in the election is because I wanted to counterpose the Jewish identity that I consider to be valid, as opposed to the Jewish identity that is imposed by the leading members of the Jewish organizational structure in Canada. I wanted to counterpose the Jewish Bundist tradition, which I learned from my mother, who comes from Warsaw. And the Jewish Bundist tradition called for social justice and civil rights for Jewish people in the countries in which they were living. Dortrecht is the here-ness concept of the Jewish Bundist movement with which it was founded, which meant that we consider ourselves to be legitimate members of the Canadian community or the Quebecois community, and that we are under no obligation to leave and go to emigrate to Israel. And secondly, we have developed a concept of national cultural autonomy, a very important constitutional concept, which I make the first principle in my election program here. But national cultural autonomy requires that, any given nation within a social system has its autonomous rights in a collective fashion to have its own school system, its own language, etc. Now, this applies to Canada-Quebec relations, if it were at all possible. That is, if English Canada conceded, national cultural autonomy to Quebec, and would apply to Quebec itself, whether it remains in Canada or not. If it doesn't win its national cultural autonomy in Canada, then most likely it will become independent. But even if it doesn't, in Quebec itself, there's a number of national minorities who need to be recognized as such and not be treated as simply second-class Québécois. The sort of official position right now of both the Parti Québécois and the Bloc Québécois is that everybody learns French and therefore they become Québécois by virtue of their speaking French. However, it's not so simple, and one just has to consult, the original Québécois members of the society to recognize, that there are differences that should be recognized, differences that are positive, actually, because, of course, people are entitled to have not just one national identity, but it's quite possible to have two or more national identities. And that's what we call hyphenated Canadianism, so that you have a designation like a Jewish Canadian or Irish Canadian, whatever, The same thing applies in Quebec, so that my son, who was raised as a francophone, for instance, would be considered to be a Jewish Québécois. And this is, again, counterposed to the Parti Québécois concept of a nation-state, which they wish to establish. And I'm counterposing the notion of national cultural autonomy to a Quebec context as well as the Canadian context.
Considering that you were involved in provincial elections in the past, what made you decide to participate specifically in the federal election this time?
Well, I was inspired to do so by my official agent, who is Rose Karambizi. There was a genocide carried out against the Hutu people in Burundi in the year 1972, and her husband was killed. And she was campaigning ever since in order to have that genocide recognized and have the perpetrators of that genocide charged with war crimes, with violation of human rights. And since 1986, she was working with Erwin Kotler in order to do something about these genocides so that they wouldn't continue. And Erwin Kotler, although he spoke at conferences and identified himself, with the campaign denouncing these genocides, never once actually managed to charge anybody with the responsibility in those genocides. And as a result, in 1994, there was a following genocide of the Tutsi people in Rwanda that Kotler could have helped to stop but he didn't take any action. Somebody who's responsible for a crime against humanity under the UN provisions, Canada would have to assume what's called universal jurisdiction. That is, Canada would have to pass a law that would enable Canada to charge somebody who's not a Canadian, which is possible. Other countries like Spain and Belgium have had such laws and have put them into effect in order to take on a certain international responsibility for human rights. Now, Kotler would not have done this here in Canada because taking on the jurisdiction of universal jurisdiction would mean that Canada would be open to considering charging any Israeli official who is responsible for any human rights violations, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza. His ideological position, I think, restrains him to the point that he's not able to accomplish very much. So that's why I'm running against him, and I was encouraged to do so by Rose Karam-Bizi.
So you would have perhaps joined with another established party had it been another riding?
Yes, I did actually ask, both the Bloc Québécois and the NDP if I could be their candidate. I did receive a reply from the Bloc Québécois saying that they had already chosen a candidate, and a very, polite, respectful reply. So I wrote back as well, indicating that I have a certain sense of solidarity with their reason for existence, but that I would continue to be an independent candidate because I considered it important to oppose Kotler. Kotler is being opposed by two other Jewish candidates as well. The conservative candidate, Sali Sundal, who is opposing him as a partisan of the Likud party in Israel. So this election campaign in that particular riding is like a replication of an election in Israel itself, except that in Israel they don't have Bundes candidates like me, so I'm the exceptional candidate, so to speak. The other candidate is the NDP candidate, Mr. Itkush, who is allied with the Israel Labour Party, which unfortunately is in an alliance with the Likud party and the coalition government that they have there. And Barak of the Labour Party was the Minister of Defense when Israel attacked Gaza. I cannot respect the affiliation of the NDP candidate in that particular riding. Therefore, I don't limit myself in that respect, and I'm quite at ease in running against the NDP candidate in that particular riding.
Since you're so passionate about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what is preventing you from being more active there politically as opposed to here in Canada?
I don't know Hebrew, so I can't really sort of intervene in Israeli society, and I don't think that the Israeli society would gladly accept somebody who comes from Toronto, Canada, to interfere in their internal affairs because they're very inward-looking. With Palestinians, I can be far more effective. I can be a Jewish voice that speaks to the Palestinians, and I can speak with a Jewish voice that is recognized as credible and legitimate, by the Palestinians, so that I can speak for the interests of Jewish people as such, independently of the interests of the State of Israel.
Considering that the Conservatives, as you've mentioned before, are gaining momentum in the Mount Royal riding,
yes,
do you really think it's wise for voters who share your views to increase the chances of a Conservative majority?
I consider this to be irrelevant. Why? Because the differences between the Liberal government and the Conservative government are negligible. I don't consider that there is much to be taken into consideration between the two, despite the progressive aspects of the Liberal Party program that are presented during election time. But once the Liberals become a government, as they've demonstrated in the past, they act in much the same fashion as a Conservative government. When the Liberals voted, 100 times to support Conservative government legislation, in the evening voted in favor of the reduction of corporate income tax, which they now say they're opposed to, but they voted for it. Now, what they're doing now during the election is irrelevant because during the actual parliament session, they voted in favor of it. So I'm not concerned about a Liberal government replacing a Conservative government because I don't think there's much of a difference between the two in any case.
Now, realistically speaking, independent candidates don't often win seats. outside of this campaign, what are your plans towards working towards the changes that you would like to see following the election?
Well, I'm working with the Alliance of Concerned Jewish Canadians to educate the Jewish community as to the needs to recognize the national rights of the Palestinian people in a reciprocal fashion. Just as Jewish people want to be recognized as being a Jewish culture, we should be capable of recognizing that another people would have the very same right to the very same identity that they claim for themselves. So if we want to retain our Jewish identity, then we're obliged to recognize the Palestinian identity as well. And secondly, I'm preparing to win an election campaign, not during this election, but for the next federal election, because my program is now out. People know what I have to say, and they will recognize that in the next 4 years that my election program was justified by the continued economic crisis that is going to be plaguing Canada and the rest of the private sector in the Western world. I believe that I will have far more credibility than any other candidate, because I'm calling for an end to the subsidies of the private sector. I mean, public monies, our monies, are being handed over to the private sector in order to sustain an unstable economic system. And supposedly the economy is being driven, according to the Conservatives, by the private sectors. It's supposed to be creating jobs and creating tax monies, for the government, etc. However, the private sector has not been able to accomplish what it considers its raison d'être. It has not been able to sustain a growing economy. In fact, it is a declining economy. So the private sector is not sustainable. In order to give public monies to the private sector, any government, whether it's a conservative or a liberal government, would just be wasting our public monies. And what is so ironic about giving public monies to the private sector is that the government doesn't even ask for a share of the control of the companies involved as well. They just give the money over. It's a dead-end kind of economic strategy. What we require is a job creation strategy, and it's the public sector that can do so. It's the government that is responsible for the welfare of the citizens, and not the private sector. And I'm certain that the private sector would agree. They're not responsible for the public interest. They're only responsible to their shareholders to make more of a profit. They're not even responsible to their own workers to provide them with a decent wage, because they're asking workers to take a wage cut in order to sustain the profitability of the private sector. So the private sector is bankrupt. We have to go to a completely different strategy. This is going to become evident, very evident, in 4 years when we go into another recession, as has already been initiated. So, coming out of another recession, I'm going to be there. And people are going to recognize that what I had to say was the only valid way to get out of a recession. I mean, either people want to go into a third recession, or they will vote for me. And people of like mind.